What's up, YouTube? Today we're going to talk about how to use art assets in Godot. To get started, let's talk about where do you get these assets. One option would be to get them for free under a common use license on websites like opengameart.org. This is a website that contains a bunch of free assets that you can use even in commercial projects. These are all open source, and so you're able to use them however you see fit. You can download them, change them yourself, whatever you need to do. The world is your oyster on something like this. You can also get assets from an asset store, something like itch.io. Some of these are paid. As you can see, these are like 50% off. This one right here is $2.50. Some of these you'll have to pay for. Some of them are going to be free, and some of them have different user licenses depending on the asset and how the creator has set those up. So I recommend also looking at itch.io. The third option would be that you could pay an artist to make custom resources for you. I've never done this myself, but my starting point would be at a job board like Fiverr or Upwork. Or the final option, and the one that most of us indie game devs are going to be using, is to make them yourself. And last video, I taught you how to make both static assets and animations in Photoshop and how to get those into Godot. So take a look at that if you're interested in a way to actually make these assets. So now let's get into Godot, and I'll show you how to actually use those assets. So the first thing that you might be wondering is, once you've downloaded these assets or made them, where do you store them? Basically, you just want to put them anywhere that's findable within your file viewer. This is just a project that I threw together very quickly, so there's not really an organization structure right here. It's typically good practice to create a new folder for your assets, and then you can store all of them in there. So that could be things like our tile map, that could be things like our animations for our character. It could be really just any piece of art or sound or really anything that you want to. The way that you set up your files is totally up to you. I'll be making a future video about a much better way to stay organized as your project grows in size. Okay, so now the assets are in there, our assets folder, but ultimately where you want to save it is in the folder that your game files are in. So you could just drag and drop any files that you want into your game folder, or if you have some type of organizational structure, you could drop them right into there. So next we're going to talk about how to use static assets. There are a couple ways to do that. One would be to have a basic Sprite 2D node. The Sprite 2D node comes with this texture option, and in order to use it, you just go down here, click load, and then you can go ahead and put your image in there, and you can see now we have an asset that we can drag and move around. We can resize it as we need to and control anything we want to here, and we can also attach a script to this node. That's the most basic way to get a piece of art into your game. Another way is if you wanted to create a background like we have here. We have a background with walls that have collisions. We can show you how to do that. This is a tile map. I'll show you the floors first. So a tile map is something I showed how to create in the last video. And basically what it ends up looking like is you have your different tiles that you drew, and then you can paint them in and you can delete them with right click once they're in there. But I'll show you how to set one of these up right now. We'll go ahead and create a TileMapLayer node. Note that TileMap is going to be deprecated in a future version of Godot, so it's best practice to use TileMapLayer. This also helps with organization because in your level, you can have a TileMapLayer for your floor, a TileMapLayer for your walls, and this can help you stay organized as you go. So I'll go ahead and add in a new tile map, and as you can see, we've got this new layer created. We can go to Tileset, New Tileset, and that will enable this right down here, this Tileset tab. We can go ahead and click new, and what we created in the last video is an atlas, and what we're going to do right now is the floor. We'll just kind of recreate what I've already done for the floor. What we created in the last video was a 250 by 250 pixel set of tiles, and so you can change the texture region, and then whenever it's actually time to paint, you'll also need to change your tile size, 250 by 250, So now, whenever we go to paint, this is 250 by 250 up here, and this is 250 by 250 for our asset size. So now if we were to click away, of course, nothing happens. We can click back in, and now we're in our tile map tab. We can select our tiles and paint them around, and then you can use right click in order to delete them. Something that's really nice about these tiles is that you don't need to create flip-flop versions because the tile map tool has options for flipping horizontally, flipping vertically, or rotating. So you can use one asset to create an entire tile map. So if we go ahead and do that, and then we have our corner pieces. Now we've just created an entire floor section with only 2 different types of tiles, which is great. It's a very powerful tool to have. You can use it for creating basically anything in your 2D game as far as map layout goes. We can also talk about setting up collision. So say that we wanted to instead create walls, we can go ahead and go to the tile set. We can add an atlas for our walls. And these are set up the exact same. They're 250 by 250. Over here, 250 by 250 as well. So now that we've imported our wall atlas, we can talk a little bit about how to set up collision. Over here on the right for your tile map layer, and this is why it's a good idea to separate out your floor and walls, we can add a physics layer. And here you can set up collision with your character and even with enemies. You can rename these layers so that it's easier to stay organized, and I can show you how to do that here in just a second. But once we have these physics layers enabled, you can go to this select tab, select the tile that you're interested in. We don't need any of these open. The one that we want is physics, and you'll do you have your new physics layer, and then what we're going to do is we're going to set up the area that we are going to collide with. So since this is a full collision type tile, you would never want to be over here. We're going to make it collide 100% of the space, and you do that by, I should make it big. So what you want to do is you want to click the add polygon tool, and then decide where the collision will actually take place. Since this is an entirely black square, we're going to have the entire square be full collision. For something like a wall, in this case actually we're going to do full collision as well because this is just supposed to be the vertical part of the wall. So we will fill this in entirely. But say for instance you were to create something like a water fountain, you have the option of creating any type of polygon you want, and if we were to put this in here, the character would only collide with the area that is this small box. So that's great for like a water fountain or bushes or a fence, anything that you want to only have a partial collision on for only a section of the tile. Once you have these collisions set up, that's everything that you need for your walls. You can see here I've done the exact same for all of these tiles, and that's all the setup that you need on your tile map. And then if we go to the player, now I can actually teach you how to do dynamic assets and to turn on your collision with your player, because we've taken care of half of it by setting up our tile map correctly. Now we need to talk about how to set up our entities like players and enemies so that they actually collide with the terrain. What you do is you go to your player node and you make sure that they have a collision shape. You can set that up like I have here, which is capsule. My player happens to be 200 pixels tall and about 100 pixels wide, and so that's the collision shape I've decided to use. And then you can go back up to your character body 2D, and this is where we're actually going to set up our collision layer. Our player should be on the player layer, and then the mask is what layers that it can collide with. And so in this case we want the player to collide with both the world and with enemies. And you can see here I've also set up the enemy in the exact same way. It has the same art assets and the same capsule shape, but you can see that I've set up the collision layer slightly differently. So this is an enemy and it's set up to mask with the world and with the player. So that's how you would set up the collision in game. And as you see, whenever I click play here and we run into the wall, you can see that this one is the enemy, this one is our player collides with our enemy collides with our wall, and our player collides with our wall. And so no one is able to go through each other. So that's collision. Now we're going to talk about setting up dynamic assets, something like an animated sprite. So what you were able to see there is that I have both the enemy and the player having animations, and they're actually set up in two different ways. Today I'm going to tell you about the animated sprite, and in a future video I'm going to go into the animated player, which is how I set up the enemy. That's an incredibly powerful tool and it deserves its own video. But first let's start with animated sprite 2D. So for animated sprite 2D, what you want to do is you create a new node called animated sprite 2D. You can click create. What you'll get whenever you have this is a need for new sprite frames. Once you create this, you'll get this little editor tab down here. You can go ahead and make this a bit bigger, and we'll hide the old animation so that that's not visible, and we'll create a new one right now. So what I like to do is rename these. So what we have is an idle and a run animation. You can click this button to create them. Click this button to delete them. You can autoplay on load. The important things to know are the FPS that you're going to be playing your animations at and whether or not you want them to loop. Here is going to be your pause and stop. Here's your play. And then here is actually how we add frames. What I showed you how to make in the last video was how to create a sprite sheet, because that's a very time efficient way to import the asset. So if we go ahead and take flagship guy sprite sheet, what we created before was 250 by 250 pixels. And so here's our sprite sheet. We're setting up the idle animation first. All you have to do is you can click on your first frame, scroll to your next frame, and then shift click. That'll select all the frames in between. And then you can go ahead and add them. Let's say that we want this to play at 30 frames per second. If we were to hit play, our character would be moving very, very quickly. Something you can also do is adjust the amount of frames that a frame is held. Let's say that we wanted to slow this down by 3x. We could either change this to 10 FPS, or we could change every single frame to hold for 3 frames. Now this looks a little bit better, and if we wanted our character to hold his position in the bottom a little bit longer, we could change this to something like 6. So you can see whenever he's at the bottom, now he kind of sits still for a second, but I think I like this better, have him just moving consistently. If this was an animation that we were only going to play one time, like for instance if they were punching, you could turn off the loop, and then whenever you hit play, they would just perform the action one time. You can also reorder these frames if you want, but in this case it's not necessary because we created our animation in Photoshop and set it up properly from the start. Now we'll go ahead and we'll create our run animation. We'll do the exact same process, starting from the beginning, and then shift clicking to add all of our frames. We're still at 30 FPS, and we want looping enabled. So whenever we play this, our character is running really fast. This is an instance of a run animation where I do want a specific portion of the animation held and focused on. And so what I'm going to do is just set up the animation to play the way I want it. And now you can see that at 30 FPS, our animation plays and it looks the way that I personally want it to. This is something that you can play with for your own animations. It's really nice to change these and play with them. See how your animation looks whenever it's held for different amounts of time. So now we've gone ahead and set up our animated sprite. The next thing you need to know about animated sprite is how do we actually activate these once we were to click the play button. From my first video, I set up a script to get basic player movement going, and I've made only a couple of changes that will allow us to activate these animations in-game. The first one is targeting our animation node and saving it as a variable. That makes it easy to access every time, and by storing it to a variable, that will save you a little bit of processing time. The next thing that we do is we check for the direction, because if we're running to the left, we want to make sure that we flip our character to the left before we play the running animation. So we check our direction based on our input, and if we're running to the left, then we will flip the animation. Otherwise, we will unflip the animation, because that would mean that we're running to the right, and then we'll play our run animation. And if we're not running, then that means that we're standing still, and so we'll go ahead and we'll play our idle animation. And it's really as simple as that for playing your animation. If you want to see other methods you can call, what you can do is you can control click on your animation node right here, and that will pull up these docs. You can look at, these are the properties that you can impact on your animation, and these are the methods that you can call, and there's a lot of them. You can feel free to read through these at any point that you like. Also note that since the animation node is built on top of other node types, you can call methods from resource, ref counted, and object. So these are not even all of the methods and properties that you can call. An example of which would be flip h, that's not called out here, as a property, but we treated it as such in our code here. So I told you I'd show you a little bit about the animation player. I'm not going to show you how I built this, but this is an incredibly powerful tool that you can use to take a bunch of static sprites. So in this case, I've taken my character, chopped them up, and here are all of the pieces done statically, and you can actually animate these through here and have your player move each piece independently. So just to show you an example of that, here you can see we have our enemy who was animated with the animation player, and then here's our player who was made with the sprite sheet. Whenever we run, you can see that these animations are also different. You can set these things up both ways, and collisions still work, of course, because collisions are separate from our animation. That's all I'm going to show today. Thanks for watching that video. I hope that you learned something new. If you liked it or would like to see more, make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe. I really appreciate your time. I hope you have a great day.